Well, welcome to our sermon slot for this, the fourth Sunday of Easter. And the Gospel reading for today is St. John's Gospel, chapter 10, verses 1 to 10. If you haven't already read that, you may wish to pause the video now and to read it at a speed comfortable to yourself, and then come back to the sermon, which will begin in a few moments' time. May I speak in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Today, on this Vocations Sunday, also known as Good Shepherd Sunday, it seems appropriate to make the announcement of our curate Rose's departure to take on a parish of her own in Pontyclun and Telegram. On behalf of everyone here in the Parish of Penarth and Llandough, we wish her and her family all the very best, and we hope and pray that she'll be as happy there as she has been here, and that the people there will look after her and value the contribution that she will undoubtedly make as their new shepherd. Today's Gospel is a little tricky to understand in some respects. The text for what is sometimes known as Good Shepherd Sunday is based on chapter 10 of St. John's Gospel. It's a little bit abstract, and John himself warns us that it's not that easy to understand. It talks about sheep and shepherds, sheepfolds, fences, gates and gatekeepers, which in Wales we all think that we know everything about already. There's certainly enough of them around in the countryside. But is there more to it than we realise? The Holy Land, as we all know, has a very varied geography. Parts are mountainous, parts are as far below sea level as you can get on land. Some of it is rich pasture, a lot of it is stony or desert. Then, as now, the geography determines what can live off the land. Sheep and goats then would have been a common sight, as they are on Welsh hillsides and on mountain sides, because they're able to eat grass and other hardy plants in areas where it's difficult or impossible to grow crops. In many places in our mind's eye, I'm sure, we probably picture stony ground under a baking sun, but that's only partially true. What is true is that sheep and goats usually moved around together, and the shepherd would go on ahead of them, calling them, sometimes by name, and they would listen. But in fact, that's not because of some Walt Disney type romantic notion. It's simply because their lives depended upon it. In Britain, sheep are moved in a particular direction by sheepdogs from behind, and whose actions seem to force the sheep into a particular course of action. In the Holy Land, by contrast, the sheep do not need coaxing or threatening. This is because the shepherd leads the flock to water, which is in short supply, or to new grazing, which is also in short supply, and without which they would starve, after having exhausted all the available vegetation on perhaps that poor rocky ground we might be picturing. For these sheep, then, there is a simple arithmetic. Follow the shepherd of your own volition, or suffer, and maybe even die. Looking at other aspects of the life of livestock and shepherds, it's a fact that Holy Land sheep and goats don't actually get on that well together, when grazing at least. They compete with one another. So when they arrive at a new spot, the shepherd might tap them, say, on the left-hand side of the head, and the goat might go off in one direction, whilst the sheep might be tapped on, say, the right-hand side of their heads and moved off to different grazing. So not competing with one another. And this may be where the image of separating the sheep and the goats comes from in other biblical passage. If you remember your Old Testament, some of the earliest inhabitants of Israel were shepherds, of course, and their large flocks would sometimes intermingle at watering holes. But when the shepherd called their names, the sheep would follow only their shepherd. The bond of trust, which had allowed those sheep to survive, and perhaps to thrive, meant the relationship was very strong. Sheepfolds, or pens as we might like to think of them, came and come in a variety of shapes and sizes. The Syrian refugee family in our parish, looked after by Parish of Penarth so very well, will be able to tell us a lot about this and about what they actually look like. The enclosure would vary according to where it was, of course, and indeed and according to how permanent it was to be. It might consist of a straightforward wall built up from the very rocks that the land provides, and quite often it would be crowned with thorns, which is both an accurate description and a fascinating metaphor, as Jesus himself, crowned with thorns, describes himself in today's passage as being both the protective walls for his flock and also, interestingly, the gate through which the flock might find safety. And also might find exits, you might want to add, so that those sheep could go back out into the world and do interesting things. The shepherds would usually move the sheep and or goats off to a pen or sheepfold for a whole variety of reasons, but especially at the end of day, so that they were protected from predators at night. Even in the time of David, a shepherd boy who became king, there were lions. By Jesus' time, the lions had gone, but individual bears, perhaps, and certainly packs of hyenas, of jackals, and of wolves were all loitering around. Being a shepherd, then, was a risky business. You had to be brave with aggressive animals, and also, indeed, with anyone who tries to steal your sheep. It was the job of the shepherd to keep an eye on anyone trying to get over the walls, but also, interestingly, to lie across the hole in the defences where the gates would be in these days, which would be therefore to keep the animals in behind his body, but also to keep the predators out. He would, in that instance, and that's a very interesting metaphor, defend his sheep with his very body and indeed his life. Another thing we might want to think about is that the role of shepherd also involves responsibility. If animals went missing, you were responsible to the owner for the cost of replacing them, and the penalties for non-payment of debts in the Near East were severe. We might also want to think about shepherds in another way too. They were outcasts from society. They were unable to take part in religious rites of purification and so were often considered ritually unclean. And we quite often think about that, don't we, at Christmas time when we think about the shepherds who are greeted in the fields by angels and then took that rather unusual step of coming into the town to see the baby Jesus. But shepherds were considered ritually unclean. But it's interesting to note, isn't it, that the angels, who were used to spending time in the actual company of God, didn't seem to mind the shepherds as much as some of the other rule-based human beings did. Perhaps this tells us a little bit more about God and the people on the margins of society, perhaps. So on this Good Shepherd Sunday, this Vocations Sunday, we see that the role of a shepherd involves many things. Understanding that the world is made up of both sheep and goats, but that both need caring for, even if they have different needs. Well, that's important. And a good shepherd must want to do that, even if it's a thankless task. The shepherd uses his knowledge, experience, and God given skills to seek out locally that which will enable his flock to survive. But a good shepherd will not be satisfied with that, and will constantly be on the lookout for opportunities to enable the flock to grow and to thrive. As a shepherd, I readily admit that I'm not very good at remembering people's names, especially if I've just met them once. But I am good at something which I think is far better, or at least well, I think that's true. I'm good at remembering stories, histories, connected facts about people. And I think that's because I don't like learning isolated facts that don't make sense to me. I prefer making connections. This is probably why I've always been better at science than languages. I think wanting to understand their flock is important for a shepherd, and it's also important for a pastor as well. In a human flock, life stories are a window into what makes someone tick. It can be as useful a guide to how people might behave in the future as anything else. So perhaps like the shepherds of the Holy Land, I build up some connections to try and understand, and I like therefore remembering details about my flock, and I do so by the associations and the life events, the happenings and the stories which have been part of their lives. And less important things do come, but come along later. But for me, I build up a little framework, a little picture in my mind about the people themselves and what makes them tick. Shepherds in the Near East and the West have different ways of setting a direction of travel. And there are as many ways of leading a faith community as there are leaders. But trust is usually earned over a period of time. It's not automatic, it's not delivered on a plate. And confidence grows as churches themselves grow in depth and often in numbers. But what's certainly true is that it is never, ever, ever achieved overnight. Everything has to be earned and worked for. The shepherds of the Near East put their lives at risk to do the very best they can for their flock. Putting their lives at risk is not usually required of clergy, thankfully, but sacrifice in other ways is certainly something that goes with the role, and perhaps it's something that only the family of clergy know just how much that involves. It's not something ever to be entered into lightly. The congregations up and down the country these days are far more aware than years ago of their own responsibilities to their clergy, which in some parts of the country, in some places, may have taken a long while to sort of come to fruition. But it has been the case that a lot of places, lots of parishes in the country have changed. And that change is very welcome. So clergy and people working together for the good of a parish is the norm in parishes up and down the country now. That's a great thing to see. The shepherds of the Holy Land had to live with difference and to be treated sometimes with suspicion by those around them. And actually, as a clergy person, it's quite often the case when you encounter so many people who have no experience of church, no experience of clergy, that For the first time they encounter you, people look at you with suspicion. Well, there's an art to dealing with that, and also to dealing with those strange people who think that being clergy means being a doormat, because it doesn't. And that's something that you can learn in your curacy if you are one of those people who are considering on this Good Shepherd Sunday becoming an ordained minister yourself. But to be a shepherd is not an act of will. You can't just decide, oh, I will be a pastor, I will lead a group of people. It's not about catering to your own secret desires. It's a sacred calling. After all, everyone is called to something in the life of the church. Last year, I spent a lot of time describing non-clerical vocations to encourage people to take part in the life of the parish more and more. Today, I will simply say that callings to clerical vocations are rarer, and their nature is tested very carefully by a very gifted team of supported individuals in each and every diocese. Certainly that's true in this diocese here in Llandough. Everyone is called, everyone in a church congregation is called, but the question is, to what? If you are considering looking at an ordained vocation, well, be aware that the team who will guide you through that process and will support you in that long process are looking for something quite special. They are looking for someone who will be able to deal with all the things that I've talked about, and in addition, someone who's got the right sort of frame of mind to look at the world and to see it differently. Someone who can see opportunities, someone who wants to change the place for the better. Someone perhaps who would consider this story of the sheep and the sheepfold and would react to it in an unusual way. Those sheepfold walls, for example, do they keep danger out? Or are they there to exclude other people's sheep? Do those walls exist to keep those on the inside in, perhaps in a very comfortable existence? Or do they have other purposes? And then we've got the gate. In Jesus, the gate, all about controlling rights of access to the elect, you might think. But is it also possible that he is also there to facilitate the leaving of the fold by the flock so that they can feed and so that they can go off and do things, very useful things, life-changing things, world-changing things beyond the walls of the sheepfold? Perhaps that's something that might have occurred to you when you were reading the passage yourself. And perhaps if we build up walls in our own life, cutting ourselves off from reality, then perhaps Jesus, the gatekeeper, helps to create openings to let life back in. It's all food for thought. Amen.